Imagine waking up every day with the feeling that you're not good enough. Young Ralf knows this feeling all too well. He was constantly ignored, underestimated, and even ridiculed by his friends and co-workers. Each comment, every laugh behind his back, weighed on his shoulders like a stone. The disrespect began to affect not only his self-esteem but also his spirit. Ralf tried to ignore it, smile, and move on. But deep inside, he felt himself sinking further. He spent sleepless nights questioning himself. Why do people treat me this way? Is there something wrong with me? These questions suffocated him, and over time, he began to doubt himself, even believing that maybe he truly had no value. One day, after yet another public humiliation at work, something inside Ralf snapped. He realized he needed help but didn't know where to find it. Then, he remembered an old book about Buddhist teachings that his grandmother had given him years ago. The yellowed pages described a distant monastery hidden in the mountains, where monks lived in peace and wisdom. Desperate for answers, Ralf decided he would go there. The journey to the monastery was long, both physically and emotionally. He reflected on every wound he carried, every word that had hurt him. When he finally arrived, the silence of the place wrapped around him like a warm blanket on a cold night. The mountain winds whispered serenity, and the tall trees seemed to shield him from the chaos he had left behind. Upon entering the temple, Ralf was greeted by a monk with calm eyes, who seemed to see far beyond what the eyes could physically observe. Without saying much, the monk invited him to sit. Feeling awkward and vulnerable, Ralf began to speak. He told the monk about his life, the constant humiliations, the weight of disrespect, and how it was destroying his confidence and peace. The monk listened patiently without interrupting, and when Ralf finally finished, he paused. The silence seemed eternal but wasn't uncomfortable. Then, in a soft voice, the monk said, "You carry a lot of weight, young man, but this weight isn't made of external stones. It comes from within. It's time to learn true strength." Intrigued, Ralf looked at the monk, waiting for more words of wisdom. The monk smiled as if he knew Ralf's journey was just beginning. Ralf woke up early the next morning. The fresh air of the monastery brought a sense of renewal, but the internal weight he carried was still present. He approached the monk again, his thoughts swirling. "I feel small," Ralf confessed. "It seems like I'll never be able to change what people think of me. How can I be strong when all I see in myself is weakness?" The monk gazed at the horizon for a long moment before answering. "True strength isn't in how others see you, but in how you see yourself. You may try to change external perceptions, but they are as fickle as the wind. Today you're respected, tomorrow ignored. And if your strength depends on that, you'll always be vulnerable." Ralf furrowed his brow. "But how can I stop caring? My whole life has been defined by what others think." The monk smiled gently. "Come, let's take a walk." They walked together to a quiet part of the garden. There, the monk pointed to a solitary tree. "This tree wasn't planted here to please anyone. It doesn't care if someone sits in its shade or admires it. It grows because it is its nature to grow. You should be the same, Ralf. You aren't here to live according to others' expectations. You're here to discover yourself and grow as you truly are." Ralf remained silent, processing the words. He felt uncomfortable, as if the idea of freeing himself from others' opinions was too frightening, almost impossible. "But how can I see myself differently?" he asked with sincere vulnerability. The monk replied calmly, "That's the next step, and it begins with how you decide to act. What are you willing to leave behind? And what are you willing to learn?" After their conversation in the garden, the monk began guiding Ralf through simple tasks like cleaning the temple and tending the garden. At first, Ralf thought these activities were irrelevant, small compared to the chaos of his life. But the monk seemed insistent. "They say that a restless mind calms itself through work," he said with a smile. "Often, when we're stuck, we procrastinate. Not because we're lazy, but because we're afraid of failing. Every delayed action is a chance not to fail." Ralf didn't see himself as someone who procrastinated. He was always busy, trying to do as much as possible to please others. But the monk observed him differently. Procrastination isn't just about putting off tasks, the monk explained one day while weeding the garden. Sometimes we put off taking care of ourselves, facing our own doubts. You've been busy with others' expectations, Ralph, but when was the last time you looked at yourself? Discipline isn't just about completing tasks, but about the commitment to care for yourself every day, regardless of what others expect. As Ralph worked alongside the monk, he began to understand that the procrastination he fought wasn't just about productivity. It was about not allowing himself the opportunity to fail so that he could learn and grow. He had been delaying his own growth out of fear. In the monastery's silence, he began developing a new routine. Each day became a small victory against procrastination, not for others but for himself. He was finally putting down roots. As the days went by, Ralph started to realize how much he doubted himself. Although he was learning to work with discipline, there was always an inner voice whispering, "This isn't enough. You're not enough." The monk observed him from afar, paying attention to his progress. One day, after a long afternoon of work, the monk sat beside Ralph and said, "Doubt is a persistent shadow, but it only has power over you if you believe in it." "How can I not believe it?" Ralph asked, with a mix of frustration and resignation. "It always seems right, always telling me I'm not capable." The monk nodded understandingly. "When you look at a shadow on the ground, it seems larger than you. But the shadow only exists because there is light. Doubt exists because there is a truth within you that you have yet to embrace." They sat in silence for a moment, the sky tinged orange by the setting sun. The monk then picked up a stone from the ground and threw it into the stream, watching the ripples spread. Just as water reflects light, your mind reflects what you project. If you project doubt, you will see only more of it. But if you project confidence, even if it's small at first, it will begin to grow. Ralph understood what the monk was trying to teach, but he knew the practice would be difficult. However, for the first time, he was willing to try, to confront his doubts and start believing that despite his mistakes and imperfections, he was capable of growth. Despite his progress, Ralph still found himself trapped in cycles of negative thinking. "I never do anything right," he told himself. "I always mess things up." One day, noticing Ralph's troubled expression, the monk called him for a different practice. Instead of manual work, he took Ralph to a quiet room inside the temple and invited him to meditate. The exercise was simple. Every time a negative thought arose, Ralph was to replace it with a positive affirmation. "That feels forced," Ralph commented, somewhat skeptical. The monk smiled. "Forced at first, yes, but over time your mind will get used to it. It's not about denying what you feel, but about recognizing that these negative thoughts are only a part of your mind, not the whole truth." During the meditation, Ralph began to notice the amount of criticism his mind generated. Every mistake, every uncomfortable memory was amplified. But as he followed the monk's advice, he started to introduce small counterpoints. "I'm doing the best I can. I'm capable of learning. I can improve." At first, it felt superficial, almost as if he was lying to himself. But over time, Ralph noticed that these positive thoughts began to create space for something he rarely felt: hope. At the end of the practice, the monk looked at him approvingly. "The mind is like a garden," he said. "If you let the weeds grow unchecked, they will take over everything. But if you plant small seeds of positivity, they will eventually bloom." Ralph began to see his mind differently, understanding that just as he cared for the monastery's garden, he could cultivate a healthier mindset. Though he was making progress, there was one thing Ralph still feared: failure. He knew that by trying something new, he might fail. And failure was something he had always avoided at all costs. It was painful, humiliating, and made him question everything. The monk noticed Ralph's restlessness, and one day, he invited him on a hike up the mountains. The trail was steep and difficult, and soon Ralph's legs began to ache. "Why are we climbing this way?" he asked, trying to control his heavy breathing. "You'll see," the monk said without slowing down. After a while, the path became so steep that Ralph slipped, falling to his knees. He let out a frustrated groan. "I knew I wouldn't make it. This is impossible." The monk stopped and looked at him with a calm smile. "You fell, yes, but what will you do now?" Irritated, Ralf began to get up. "I'll try again." The monk nodded. "Exactly. Failure is not the end, Ralf. It's part of the journey. You get up, dust yourself off, and try again. Every time you fail, you learn. Every fall is a lesson." They continued climbing, and Ralf fell a few more times, but each time it happened, he got up more determined. When they finally reached the top, he was exhausted, but a sense of accomplishment washed over him. He had failed several times, but each of those failures brought him closer to his goal. The monk, seeing Ralf's expression, said, "Failure is the greatest teacher we can have. It teaches us resilience, shows us where we need to grow, and strengthens us. Don't fear it. Embrace it." Over time, Ralf began to realize that the opinions of others had much less weight in his life. He no longer depended so much on external approval, but there were still moments when he found himself seeking validation from others, even if subtly. One day, the monk gave Ralf a simple task: to carry water from the well to the temple. But there was a curious detail. The monk gave him a bucket with a small hole in it. "This bucket has a hole," Ralf exclaimed, confused. The monk nodded with a smile. "I know. Now do your best." Intrigued, Ralf went to the well, filled the bucket, and began carrying the water back to the temple. But by the time he arrived, half the water had already leaked out through the hole. He looked at the monk, disappointed. "I failed," Ralf said, frustrated with himself. "I couldn't bring all the water." The monk approached him with a calm look. "You did the best you could, even with an imperfect bucket. Life is like that, Ralf. You may never please everyone. You may never be perfect in the eyes of others. But as long as you know you're doing your best with what you have, that's enough." Ralf was silent for a moment, processing the lesson. He had always sought perfection and the approval of others as a measure of success. But the monk was showing him that his own acceptance was the true measure. "Stop carrying the burden of others' opinions," the monk said gently. "You can never control what others think, but you can control how you respond to it. And the only approval you truly need is your own." Ralf smiled, feeling a lightness in his chest that he had never felt before. He knew the path to self-affirmation would still be long, but now he understood that his worth did not depend on others' expectations. The monk's final lesson was the hardest for Ralf. He had learned to discipline himself, to believe more in himself, to handle failure, but there was still a part of him that wanted to hold on to everything, to control every aspect of his life. One morning, the monk took Ralf to the top of a hill overlooking the monastery. There, the wind blew strong, and the trees swayed gently in its force. The monk pointed to the trees and said, "They don't fight against the wind. They bend, adapt, but never break. They know they can't control nature. They simply flow with it." Ralf watched the trees for a long time. He had always thought that control was synonymous with strength, but now he realized it was the opposite. True strength lay in letting go, in allowing life to take its course. "I'm afraid of losing control," Ralf finally admitted, confessing his greatest fear. "I'm afraid of what might happen if I just let go." The monk smiled, placing a hand on Ralph's shoulder. "Control is an illusion, Ralf. You never had control. Life has always been unpredictable. When you let go of the need to hold on to everything so tightly, you discover something wonderful: freedom." They stood there in silence, watching the wind carry the leaves and sway the trees. Ralf felt a deep peace growing inside him. He finally understood that, in trying to control everything, he was actually holding himself back. And in letting go, he was finally setting himself free. Thanks for watching. Here we come to the end of the story to teach us 6 habits to be respected by others based on Buddhist teachings. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications. Share with your friends and leave your comments below about what you thought of the story. We always bring inspiring stories with teachings for modern life.